My name is Michael. I was born and raised in the heart of Texas, where the roads seem endless and the horizon is a thin line separating the sky from the earth. When you spend so much time driving, you begin to realize that highways are not just paved paths but an extension of yourself. Each mile traveled is a reflection on life, a silent dialogue between man and machine. From a young age, I was always fascinated by trucks. My father, also a truck driver, used to take me on his trips. He taught me the art of driving, to respect the road, and, above all, to listen to the whispers of the asphalt. When he passed away, he left me his old truck, a classic Peterbilt 379 that I nicknamed Bessie. Inheriting Bessie was not just receiving a truck but a legacy, a responsibility to continue the family tradition. My life on the road is solitary, but it was a choice. I prefer the company of long stretches of asphalt to complicated relationships and crowded cities. Solitude allows me to think, and each trip is an opportunity for introspection. At 38, I've seen a bit of everything. Accidents, storms, landscapes, and people from diverse backgrounds. I've learned to be resilient, to face challenges without hesitation. This is the nature of a trucker, after all. However, life on the road is not easy. Bills keep coming, and maintaining Bessie in good condition is not cheap. Lately, expenses have increased, along with my financial worries. This need led me to accept a strange and well-paid job. Normally, I am cautious with unknown cargo, but the offer was too good to refuse. It all started with a call from an unknown number. The man on the other end introduced himself as Thomas, a representative of a logistics company. He explained that they had special cargo, something that needed to be transported from a military facility in Utah to a destination that couldn't be revealed until the last moment. The payment was generous, more than enough to cover my expenses for several months. My curiosity, always present, was piqued by the mysterious nature of the offer. Something in me wanted to know more, to discover what lay behind this secret cargo. But it was the financial need that really weighed in the decision. I needed the money, and fast. Upon accepting the job, I was instructed to follow a series of strict protocols. First, I had to go to the military facility in Utah and present my documents. There, the cargo would be placed in my truck without me being able to see its content. Then, I had to follow a specific route, avoiding large cities and unnecessary stops. Any deviation or delay would be severely penalized. As I drove to Utah, I couldn't help but feel a slight apprehension. Something in Thomas's tone, the urgency of the job, and the mystery surrounding the cargo made me uncomfortable. However, I decided not to worry too much. I had transported strange cargo before, from exotic animals to valuable works of art. What could be so different this time? Upon arriving at the military facility, I was greeted by uniformed men who did not say a word to me. I just handed over my documents, and after a quick verification, I was directed to a huge hangar where my truck would be loaded. I waited beside Bessie, watching as a sealed container was carefully placed on the flatbed. The silence of the place was oppressive, broken only by the sounds of cranes and tools. When I finally left the facility, night had already fallen. The container was secure, and the instructions were clear. Follow the planned route and do not open the cargo under any circumstances. With a mix of curiosity and concern, I began the long journey, not knowing that this would be the beginning of a trip that would change my life forever. The night sky stretched out before me, dotted with stars that offered faint company on my lonely journeys. As Bessie roared down the deserted road, a sense of unease began to settle in. There was something strange about that night, something that made me constantly check the mirrors, expecting to see something out of the ordinary. I had already traveled a good 200 miles since leaving the military facility. Thomas's instructions were clear, and I followed them to the letter. Stops were minimal, only to refuel and check if the container was well secured. At one of these stops, something caught my attention. While refueling Bessie at an isolated gas station, a dark car parked a few meters away. The driver remained inside the vehicle, the dark windows preventing any view of its interior. I didn't pay much attention at the time, but an uncomfortable sensation began to crawl up my spine. When I finished and returned to the road, I noticed that the same car was behind me, keeping a safe but visible distance. At first, I thought it might be a coincidence. After all, it was a common road, and other drivers used it too. But when the car maintained a constant distance for more than 50 miles, I began to suspect. The road was practically deserted, and the only thing keeping me company was that ominous car. The first pursuit was nothing blatant. The car followed from afar, like a predator watching its prey. At every turn, at every lane change, it was there, always at the edge of my vision. I tried to ignore it, focus on the road and my thoughts, but the constant presence was disturbing. I decided to test my suspicions. On a stretch of road where there was an exit to a small town, I signaled to change direction, watching through the mirror. The car hesitated but eventually followed the same path. By this point, my heart was racing and adrenaline began to take over. I returned to the main road, now certain that I was being followed. What did those people want? Was it just a coincidence or something more sinister? The container behind me seemed to pulse with a malevolent presence, and I began to wonder if it had something to do with the pursuit. The following hours were tense. The car continued to follow, keeping its distance but never leaving my sight. Every headlight in the mirror felt like a pair of watchful eyes, monitoring my every move. I decided not to stop at any gas stations or rest areas. I felt that any stop could be an opportunity for them to get closer. Finally, near dawn, the pursuit began to intensify. On an isolated stretch of road, a second car appeared, joining the first. Now, I was being followed by two vehicles, both without plates. The sensation of being hunted became unbearable. The cars began to close in, their maneuvers becoming increasingly bold and threatening. They were testing my limits, trying to make me stop or make a mistake. I kept my hands steady on the wheel, my heart pounding in my chest, while trying to stay calm and think of a way out of that situation. As the sun began to rise on the horizon, bringing illusory relief, I knew that the rail journey was just beginning, and whatever was in the container had the power to attract something very dangerous. After hours of tension and pursuit, the cars disappeared, and I finally found a spot where I could stop and breathe a bit. It was an isolated rest area, hidden among the mountains, with only a couple of trucks parked and a small cafe open 24 hours. The cars that had been following me had disappeared momentarily, giving me a false sense of security. I parked Bessie in a secluded corner and turned off the engine. The ensuing silence was almost deafening after so many hours of constant noise. I got out of the truck, stretching my legs and trying to relax. However, the feeling of being watched did not leave me. I walked to the cafe, feeling the cold asphalt under my boots. The place was empty except for a bored waitress behind the counter and a man sitting in a corner, wrapped in a worn coat. He glanced at me briefly and went back to staring at the coffee cup in his hands. I ordered a black coffee and sat at a table near the window, from where I could watch Bessie. The container, with its sinister presence, seemed even more threatening under the dim streetlights. As I sipped my coffee, trying to calm my nerves, the man in the corner stood up and approached. "You're the driver of that truck, aren't you?" he said, his voice hoarse and low. I nodded cautiously. There was something about him that made me uneasy, a sort of desperate urgency in his eyes. "Listen carefully, you need to abandon that cargo now, before it's too late." I stayed silent, trying to process what he was saying. My mind was filled with questions, but the man seemed to have little disposition for explanations. "What are you talking about?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. He looked around, as if fearing to be overheard, and leaned closer to me. "That container is cursed. There's something in there that shouldn't be transported. I've seen this before. The people who deal with these things don't end well." My heart raced, but I forced myself to stay calm. As much as his words echoed my own fears, I couldn't just abandon the cargo. Not without knowing more. "Who are you?" I questioned. "And why should I believe you?" The man sighed, as if carrying the weight of the world on his shoulders. "I was like you, a driver, until I accepted a job similar to yours. I transported something I shouldn't have, and I paid the price. Now, I try to warn others not to make the same mistake. I know it sounds crazy, but if you continue with that cargo, you're signing your own death warrant." Before I could respond, he quickly walked away, disappearing into the darkness of the parking lot. I sat there, the coffee cup forgotten in my hands, trying to process the encounter. His warning resonated in my mind, making it impossible to ignore what he said. I returned to Bessie with a deep sense of unease. I looked at the container again, feeling an almost palpable presence emanating from it. The stranger's words echoed in my mind, making every shadow seem more threatening. I climbed into the truck and started the engine, determined to continue the journey, but now with a new caution. If there was any truth to what the man said, I would need to be more vigilant than ever. The road ahead seemed even darker, and the journey, far from over, seemed to just begin revealing its horrors. As I accelerated down the road, the sun beginning to rise on the horizon, a persistent question lingered in my mind. What was really inside that container, and why did it seem to attract so many dangers? The answer, I knew, lay further down the road, waiting to be discovered, and the price to obtain that answer might be too high. As the day progressed, the fatigue began to weigh on me. It wasn't just the physical exhaustion of driving for hours on end, but a deep mental weariness. The encounter with the stranger at the rest stop still echoed in my head, and his words haunted me like a sinister echo. I tried to push the thoughts away as I drove, focusing on the road ahead. But it didn't take long for the scenery around me to start changing in ways I couldn't explain. The shadows seemed to stretch longer than normal, creating strange and distorted shapes. The streetlights along the road flickered, casting flashes that blurred my vision. That's when it happened for the first time. A glimpse in the rearview mirror, a shadowy figure moving quickly. I looked again, and there was nothing there. I shook my head, trying to dismiss the feeling that something was terribly wrong. Minutes later, a throbbing headache set in, and I felt a growing pressure in my head. I blinked repeatedly, trying to clear my vision, but instead, I was thrown into a completely different scene. I was in a dense forest, surrounded by tall trees whose canopies blocked almost all the light. In the center, there was a circle of people dressed in black robes, their faces hidden under hoods. They murmured chants in a language I couldn't understand, but that resonated with a malevolence that chilled my blood. In the center of the circle was a stone altar stained with blood. On it lay a motionless figure, a human sacrifice. The hooded figures raised their hands in unison, and the chanting intensified, filling the air with palpable energy. I tried to scream, but my voice wouldn't come out. I was trapped in the vision, forced to watch. Then suddenly I was back at the wheel. The container behind me seemed to vibrate with its own energy, as if it were alive. Sweat ran down my face, and my heart was pounding uncontrollably. My hands trembled as I tried to control Bessie on the road. The visions didn't stop. Every few minutes, I was thrown back into that forest, watching the rituals unfold in even more macabre ways. The chants, the sacrifices, the hooded faces. Everything was so real that I could smell the blood and the damp earth beneath my feet. I began to question my sanity. Was I really seeing these things? Or was my mind playing tricks on me? The visions were so vivid, so detailed, that it was hard to believe they were just imagination. Each time I returned to reality, I felt a momentary relief, only to be pulled back into the nightmare minutes later. The road ahead seemed endless, each mile heavier than the last. With each new vision, the sense of dread grew. Whatever was inside that container had the power to invade my mind, showing me horrors I never imagined. I began to consider the stranger's words at the rest stop. Maybe he was right. Maybe the only way to save myself was to abandon the cargo. But the financial need, the promise of a payment that would solve my problems for months, prevented me from making that decision. As night fell, the visions became more frequent and more intense. Every time I closed my eyes, even for a blink, I saw twisted faces in agony, heard screams of despair, and felt a malevolent presence around me. Finally, after hours of torment, I decided I needed help. I couldn't continue like this. I couldn't let these visions destroy me. I grabbed the phone and dialed Thomas's number, my voice trembling as I waited for him to answer. "Thomas, this is Michael. We need to talk about this cargo. Something is very wrong." The line was silent for a moment, and when Thomas finally spoke, his voice was calm but loaded with an urgency I hadn't noticed before. "Michael, I know it's difficult, but you need to continue. Just follow the instructions, and everything will be fine." I hung up the phone, feeling even more confused and terrified. The road ahead was shrouded in darkness, and I knew the visions would only get worse. But I had no choice but to continue, hoping that somehow I would reach the end of this infernal journey. The visions left me on the brink of madness. Each mile traveled felt like an eternity, and the line between reality and hallucination became increasingly blurred. The deserted road ahead of me offered no solace, just an unrelenting emptiness that fed my fears. The idea of opening the container, something I had rejected from the start, began to seem inevitable. I needed to know what I was carrying. I needed to understand what was tormenting me. I found an isolated detour and parked Bessie in a hidden clearing. The silence around me was oppressive, broken only by the occasional rustling of leaves in the wind. I walked to the back of the truck, my heart pounding in my chest. Thomas's words echoed in my mind, but the need for answers was stronger. With trembling hands, I took the key given to me at the military facility and unlocked the container. The door creaked open, revealing almost palpable darkness. The twilight light slowly filtered in, illuminating the interior. The escaping air was dense and carried a strange smell, a mixture of damp earth and something rotten. In the center of the container rested an ancient altar, made of dark stone and covered with symbols I couldn't decipher. It was an imposing structure that exuded a malevolent energy. I approached slowly, feeling a sinister presence around me. Each step seemed harder than the last, as if something invisible was trying to stop me from getting closer. When I finally stood before the altar, I noticed even more disturbing details. Small artifacts were arranged around it. Unlit candles, animal skulls, and ritual objects that seemed to come from a nightmare. In the center of the altar, there was a cornerstone stained with dried blood, as if it had recently been used in macabre rituals. As I touched the stone, a wave of energy passed through me, momentarily darkening my vision. Images flashed in my mind, scenes of human sacrifices, dark chants, and hooded figures performing profane rituals. Everything felt terribly real, as if I were experiencing it in real time. Suddenly, I heard a whisper around me, a low and threatening voice that seemed to come from all directions. I tried to pull away, but my feet seemed glued to the ground. The sensation of being watched intensified, and I realized I was not alone. Shadows began to move at the edges of my vision, indistinct outlines of figures that seemed to watch my every move. "You opened the door," whispered the voice, resonating in my mind. "Now you are marked." I tried to fight the growing panic, but the presence around me became increasingly oppressive. Finally, I managed to pull away from the altar, stumbling out of the container and slamming the door shut. Panting, I leaned against the truck, feeling cold sweat run down my face. I was dealing with something beyond my comprehension, something that shouldn't have been disturbed. The altar, with its malevolent energy, seemed to have awakened ancient and dangerous forces. Everything made sense now: the visions, the pursuers, the strange warning at the rest stop. I was involved in something much larger and more sinister than a simple cargo transport. As I regained control of my breathing, I knew that from that moment on, nothing would be the same. I had to decide between continuing the journey, aware of the horrors that awaited me, or abandoning the cargo and facing the consequences. Whatever the choice, one thing was certain. I was marked, and whatever was on that altar would not leave me alone. With renewed determination and a deep-seated fear, I climbed back into Bessie's cab. I started the engine and resumed the road, knowing that the real struggle was just beginning. The malevolent energy of the altar still pulsed in my mind, and the sinister presence seemed to accompany me, a constant reminder of what I had unleashed. As I drove through the darkness, one thing was clear. This was not just an ordinary delivery journey, but a battle for my own sanity and survival. The road ahead seemed endless, each mile more desolate than the last. The weight of the container and what lay inside it was a constant presence, a shadow hovering over me. The visions continued to plague my mind, but now I knew they were not mere hallucinations. They were a reflection of the disturbing reality I had become involved in. Barely had the sun set again when the cars reappeared. Their headlights cut through the darkness like predatory eyes, and I knew the pursuers were back, more determined than ever. The first sign that something was about to happen was a flickering light on the horizon. As I got closer, I saw that they were torches, arranged along the road like a ritualistic barricade. The unmarked cars were there, parked in a way that partially blocked the road. A group of hooded figures moved among them, their sinister silhouettes illuminated by the torch flames. My heart raced and adrenaline took over. I knew I had to act quickly. I pressed hard on the accelerator, determined to pass through the blockade before the cultists could react. But they were ready. The hooded figures raised their hands, beginning to chant darkly, their words vibrating in the air around me. The road seemed distorted, as if the asphalt itself was writhing under the influence of their words. Bessie roared, the tires screeching as I tried to swerve around the obstacles and the approaching cultists. One of them threw themselves in front of the truck, and I had to turn abruptly to avoid hitting them. The container shook violently, nearly toppling over, but I managed to keep control. The adrenaline made my body react almost automatically. With a sharp movement, I steered the truck towards the parked cars, forcing them out of the way. The hooded figures scattered, but they did not give up. In the rearview mirror, I saw them quickly return to their cars and begin to follow me again. The chase continued through the night, becoming increasingly intense. The cultists were no longer just shadows in the distance. Now they were determined to intercept me. They drove dangerously close, trying to force me off the road. Occasionally, I glimpsed their pale faces and feverish eyes behind the hoods, their blind devotion evident in their expressions. At one point, one of the cars got too close, colliding with Bessie's side. The impact made the truck sway, and for a moment, I thought I would lose control. But I managed to recover, and with a sharp movement, I pushed the car off the road, where it overturned in a cloud of dust and debris. However, they kept coming. More cars appeared, as if they materialized from nowhere, their lights piercing the darkness and their maneuvers increasingly bold. The road, once solitary, now seemed like a battlefield. Then I saw something that made my blood run cold. Ahead, a group of cultists had positioned themselves in the middle of the road, forming a circle around a symbol drawn with fire. The flames danced in the wind, and they were in the middle of some kind of ritual. There was no way to swerve. I would have to go through them or be stopped. I yelled to myself as I accelerated even more, Bessie's engine roaring like an enraged animal. The hooded figures held their ground, as if they were willing to sacrifice their lives to stop me. When I was a few meters away, they raised their hands, and an intense glow emanated from the fiery symbol. A wave of energy hit me, making the truck shudder. My vision blurred, and for a moment, I thought I would pass out. But with fierce determination, I managed to keep my eyes open and grip the wheel with all my strength. Bessie plowed forward, breaking through the circle of fire and scattering the cultists. As I left the chaos behind, the sense of relief was brief. I knew they wouldn't give up easily. The sinister presence of the altar in the container seemed to pulse with renewed intensity, and the road ahead promised more challenges and horrors. I continued driving, increasingly aware that I was dealing with forces beyond my comprehension. The fight for my sanity and survival was just beginning, and the true nature of the cargo I was transporting remained a dark mystery. The road seemed to stretch infinitely before me, a tunnel of asphalt and darkness. The hours blurred together, and I began to lose track of time. The world around me became increasingly indistinct, as if I were seeing everything through a veil. The visions, once intermittent, now became constant, and the line between reality and delusion was rapidly dissolving. My mind was a battlefield. Every time I closed my eyes, even for a moment, I was assaulted by images of macabre rituals and human sacrifices. The hooded figures, with their hypnotic chants, seemed more real than ever. I felt the malevolent energy of the altar pulsing, invading my consciousness and planting seeds of chaos. Fear turned into paranoia. Every shadow on the road, every headlight in the rearview mirror, seemed like an imminent threat. I began to doubt everything around me, including myself. The whispers incited me to acts of violence that terrified me. Fighting against these disturbing thoughts was a constant and exhausting battle. The first time the thought occurred, it was like a quick and terrifying spark, to drive the truck into a car passing beside me. My fingers gripped the wheel tightly as I fought the urge to swerve sharply. I took a deep breath, trying to push the thought away, but it persisted, like a parasite rooted in my mind. Another horrible thought struck me as I passed through a small, deserted and silent town. I imagined accelerating the truck and running over any pedestrian that appeared, spreading destruction for no reason. I shuddered at the thought, feeling a wave of nausea wash over me. These thoughts were not mine. I knew that, but they were there, insistent, trying to take control. The sensation of being corrupted by the cargo intensified. I felt as if the altar was draining my sanity, turning my thoughts into something evil. Fighting against this was like swimming against a powerful current, and every moment I felt weaker, more vulnerable. On an especially dark night, as I traversed an isolated stretch of forest, the visions became unbearable. The trees around me seemed to close in, their shadows turning into threatening figures. I felt the fixed gaze of invisible eyes, and the whispers turned into screams, inciting me to commit atrocities. It seemed that I was losing the battle. Paranoia and fear became overwhelming, and I knew I needed a moment to regain control. I found an abandoned rest area and parked Bessie, turning off the engine and trying to calm my mind. The silence was oppressive but necessary. I closed my eyes, breathing deeply, and began to focus on simple and familiar things. The texture of the wheel under my hands, the distant sound of a river flowing, the memory of peaceful moments with my father. Gradually, the storm in my mind began to dissipate, and the disturbing thoughts receded like shadows fleeing the light. I opened my eyes, determined not to let the cargo defeat me. I needed to stay focused, remember who I was, and why I was doing this. The money was important, but my sanity and integrity were more. I fought against the influence of the altar, determined not to let it corrupt me. I returned to the road, still haunted, but with renewed determination. I knew the internal struggle would be constant, but I was ready to face it. With each mile traveled, I reaffirmed my commitment to complete the journey without succumbing to the darkness surrounding me. As I accelerated again, the container behind me seemed to pulse with a sinister energy. But now I was prepared to resist. With a focused mind and resolute heart, I was determined to win the battle for my own soul, no matter the cost. The winding road stretched before me like an inevitable path to the unknown. Each mile traveled increased the pressure on my shoulders and the tension in my mind. Paranoia was now a constant companion, and the pressure to make a decision reached its peak. The altar in the container seemed to pulse with a malevolent energy, intensifying my thoughts and feelings. As I drove, the internal struggle intensified. Should I continue with the delivery, fulfill my contract, and receive the payment I so desperately needed? Or should I try to destroy the cargo and rid myself of the threat that seemed to grow within me every second? Both options had heavy consequences, and the choice was not clear. I remembered Thomas's words, insisting that I follow through with the delivery, and the stranger at the rest stop who warned me of the danger. Both seemed to have some knowledge about the cargo, but their intentions and the truth behind their words remained nebulous. With each stop to refuel or rest, the doubt grew. With each macabre vision and dark whisper, the need for a decision became more urgent. I began to question everything: my sanity, my choices, even my own identity. The visions and disturbing thoughts were eating away at me from within, and the malevolent presence of the altar was felt in every fiber of my being. In a moment of clarity, I decided I needed a pause to think. I found a detour to a deserted rest area, a secluded place where I could be alone with my thoughts. I parked Bessie, turned off the engine, and got out of the truck, feeling the weight of the decision I was about to make. The night was cold and silent, with only the distant sound of nocturnal animals and the wind blowing through the trees. I walked a bit, trying to clear my mind, but the presence of the altar seemed to follow me, a persistent shadow that could not be ignored. I sat on a wooden bench, looking at the starry sky and trying to find some peace. The stranger's words at the rest stop echoed in my mind. "You are dealing with something you don't understand," he said. But what did it really mean to destroy the cargo? How could I do that without fully understanding what I was dealing with? I thought about the possible consequences of destroying the altar. What if the released malevolent energy was even more dangerous? What if I was doomed by doing so, unleashing something even worse into the world? But the alternative of continuing the delivery didn't seem promising either. Each mile brought me closer to the unknown destination, and the sense of danger increased. The decision weighed on me like a stone, and the urgency to choose became unbearable. I got up from the bench and walked back to Bessie, the dilemma still swirling in my mind. I climbed into the cab and sat there, staring at the dashboard, the silence inside the truck as oppressive as the thoughts in my head. As I tried to gather the courage to make a decision, an idea emerged. I needed more time, I needed more information. Destroying the altar or continuing the delivery were definitive and irreversible choices, and I needed to be sure I was making the right decision. I started the engine and returned to the road, but this time with a plan. I would find a safe place to stop for longer, a place where I could think calmly and perhaps find answers. I drove for a few miles until I found an old truck stop, abandoned and overgrown. It seemed like a good enough place for a longer pause. I parked Bessie and turned off the engine, getting out of the truck and looking around. The place was quiet, deserted, but it offered the sense of isolation I needed. I decided to spend the night there, trying to resolve the dilemma that consumed me. As the wind gently blew through the trees and the night fell around me, I prepared myself for the crucial decision that would change the course of my journey. I knew the choice would not be easy, but the need to face my destiny and the cargo I was transporting was inevitable. The true battle was just beginning, and I needed to be ready to face whatever came next. The old abandoned truck stop was engulfed in a silent darkness, providing the isolation I needed to confront the decision that consumed me. Sitting in Bessie's cab, I knew I couldn't delay any longer. It was time to face the truth about the cargo I was transporting. In the darkness, I began to hear murmurs and whispers, as if the wind itself was speaking to me. Hooded figures appeared around the truck, their eyes glowing under the dim moonlight. They approached slowly, their dark chants filling the air with a sense of dread. I got out of the truck, determined to face whatever came. The hooded figures formed a circle around me, their voices rising in a crescendo of malevolent power. In the center of the circle, the altar in the container seemed to pulse with a sinister light, as if it were alive. "You cannot escape, Michael," one of the figures said, their voice familiar, resonating within my mind. "The altar demands sacrifices. Destroying us will only make things worse." The desperate battle began. I fought with everything I had, using anything within reach to fend off the hooded figures. However, as the fight intensified, a disturbing truth began to emerge. The blows I dealt passed through the cultists, as if they were made of mist. Their distorted faces transformed into reflections of myself, and the chants became echoes of my own voice. That's when the shocking revelation hit me. The cars that pursued me, the cultists that tormented me, all of it was an illusion created by the altar. My mind had been manipulated, corrupted by the malevolent power I was carrying. The true battle was not against external forces, but against my own sanity. I fell to my knees, panting, as the distorted reality faded around me. The altar in the container still pulsed with malevolent energy, but now I understood the true nature of what I was facing. The voices continued to whisper, urging me to destroy the altar and end the torment. If you destroy the altar, the entities trapped within will be released, and chaos will spread. The voice in my head was clear and relentless. Your only option is to complete the delivery. Feeling defeated but determined to finish what I had started, I returned to Bessie. The truck felt like an extension of my own will, and I knew this would be the last trip with that cursed cargo. I drove through the night, the whispers and visions diminishing as I approached the destination. Each mile traveled was a battle against the temptation to destroy the altar and end it all. But I knew the consequences would be terrible, and my own survival was at stake. Finally, I arrived at the delivery location, an isolated and heavily guarded facility. Uniformed men awaited me, and without a word, they unloaded the container. The sense of relief was immediate, but accompanied by a shadow of uncertainty about what would happen next. Thomas appeared, his face serious but relieved. "Good job, Michael. You did what needed to be done." He handed me a thick envelope with my payment. I nodded, feeling a strange mix of relief and resignation. The journey had come to an end, but the marks left by it would stay with me forever. With the payment in hand, I returned to the road, determined never to get involved with mysterious cargo again. My life slowly returned to normal, but the memories of the horrors I faced remained, a constant reminder of the fragility of sanity and the hidden dangers in the shadows of the unknown. Now, whenever I look at the horizon, I feel a hint of distrust and a renewed resolve. The road is my companion, but I will never again allow its mysteries to drag me into darkness. If you enjoyed this story, subscribe to the channel and check out the next story playing on the screen.